Montana Territory, autumn of 1887. Nobody noticed what was happening beneath Samuel Garrett's barn. From the outside, it looked like any other weathered structure dotting the valley floor. Rough-hewn pine timber, a sloped cedar shingle roof, patched in spots with dark tar paper, and heavy bales of sweet clover hay stacked high against the northern wall to break the incoming mountain drafts. To anyone passing along the dusty wagon track, it was just another frontier farmer preparing for another brutal northern Rockies winter. But underneath that ordinary pine barn floor, something extraordinary was taking shape. While his neighbors stockpiled cord after cord of mountain firewood until their arms burned, while they chinked every visible seam in their cabin walls with wet river moss and sticky gray clay, while they prepared to fight winter the same exhausting way their grandfathers had, Samuel was digging, and his neighbors were convinced he had lost his mind. If you want to discover practical frontier survival techniques every week that actually worked when human lives hung in the balance, hit that subscribe button for our channel right now, and drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from today. We read every single one of your responses, because what happened during that bitter winter of 1887 would forever change how the settlers in that wind-scoured valley thought about warmth, shelter, and the very ground beneath their boots. The question among the homesteaders was not whether Samuel Garrett had lost his sanity. The question was, what did this former miner understand about thermodynamic survival that everyone else in the territory had completely missed? Make no mistake, this was not some impulsive experiment born out of panic or wild desperation. Samuel Garrett was 42 years old, a quiet, broad-shouldered man who had spent 10 long years working the subterranean copper shafts in Butte. 10 years of 12-hour shifts, down in dark timbered tunnels that stretched thousands of feet deep into the granite bones of the mountain. And down in those subterranean depths, hundreds of feet below the daylight, Samuel had observed something that every veteran hard rock miner knew, but few ever paused to truly contemplate. The temperature down there never shifted. Summer or winter, scorching July afternoons, or frozen January mornings, when the mountain wind cut like a razor, the deep rock face stayed entirely constant. Not cold enough to freeze water in a canteen, yet never warm enough to make a working man sweat excessively. Just a steady, unyielding baseline temperature. While other miners viewed those underground tunnels as brutal, suffocating tombs from which they longed to escape, Samuel saw them as an education in earth physics. He learned how the solid earth insulates, how depth creates thermal stability, and how the planet itself maintains a living baseline warmth that has absolutely nothing to do with the freezing weather raging across the surface above. When he finally walked away from the Butte copper mines, purchased his homestead claim, and began raising his young family in a high valley where mountain winters routinely slaughtered livestock and sickened children, that subterranean knowledge stayed buried in his mind. It waited silently until the terrifying year his youngest son nearly did not survive the frozen month of February. Samuel had bought his claim 3 years earlier, with hard-won savings earned underground. The ironies of his life were never lost on him. He had spent a decade tunneling through solid rock to earn a living. And now, standing on his own ground, he found himself picking up a shovel to tunnel through the earth once again. But this time, he was not digging for red copper ore to enrich Eastern investors. He was digging for the physical survival of his family. His wife, Margaret, managed their small homestead household while raising their 3 young children. Elizabeth was 9 years old, a sharp-eyed girl who loved books. William was 7, energetic and eager to help his father with morning farm chores. And little James had just turned 4. The log cabin they lived in was solid enough by local frontier standards. Built from straight, notch-fitted yellow pine logs, set upon a dry limestone fieldstone foundation, with a massive stone chimney, Samuel had painstakingly laid himself. By the standards of 1887 Montana Territory, it was a respectable home. Truth be told, respectable did not mean warm. Every winter on the high plains told the exact same brutal story. By late November, air temperatures would plunge to 20, 30, and sometimes 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The howling Arctic wind that screamed down from the high mountain passes did not merely chill a building, it hunted. It searched relentlessly for every minute crack, every dried seam, every microscopic weakness in a log structure. And firewood, the only fuel that kept human blood moving through frontier veins, was becoming increasingly difficult to harvest. The nearest stands of dense, dry timber were located 3 miles uphill through heavy snowdrifts. Samuel would spend 2 full days chopping with an axe, and another full day hauling loaded log sleds down treacherous slopes with his team of draft horses. A decent homestead cabin required anywhere from 12 to 15 cords of hardwood to endure a 6-month winter. Yet their cabin devoured wood at a terrifying rate. The iron firebox needed constant feeding every 4 hours, sometimes every 2 hours, when the barometer plummeted and atmospheric pressure drove freezing air through the floorboards. At night, as the family slept, the hearth fire would inevitably die down to glowing embers, and by morning, thick white sheets of frost would form on the glass window panes and coat the heads of the iron nails inside the cabin walls. The 3 children slept tucked together in a single narrow loft bed, huddled beneath every woolen blanket, bison robe, and quilted sheet the family possessed. Margaret would heat heavy river stones in the hearth fire until they glowed faintly, wrap them carefully in thick flannel cloth, and tuck them down near the children's frozen feet before slipping into bed herself. But by 3 o'clock in the morning, those river stones were as cold as mountain ice. The previous winter, little James had caught a severe pulmonary congestion that refused to break for nearly 3 agonizing weeks. A wet, rattle-chested cough that sounded like tearing linen, accompanied by shallow, rapid breathing that terrified Margaret during the pitch-black hours before dawn. The frontier doctor from Helena, when he finally arrived after a 3-day delay, navigating snowbound trails, looked at the pale child, looked at the drafty log walls, and stated the plain reality. The bitter indoor cold weakens their tiny lungs. If you cannot keep this room warm through the night, he warned, the boy will not survive another severe winter. Samuel had stood inside his empty timber barn that spring, watching his breath form thick white vapor clouds in the crisp April air, and made his decision. He had spent 10 years underground. He understood a fundamental law of nature that traditional farmers completely overlooked. The earth holds energy. 6 feet down beneath the soil, below the territorial frost line, the granite rock face in those deep butte shafts maintained a steady 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year round. The frozen air on the surface might be 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, but 6 feet beneath the soles of a man's boots, the earth ignored the sky entirely. It was the planet's own natural thermal baseline, created by the massive heat capacity of soil and rock that absorbed solar radiation through long summer months and released it with incredible slowness over winter. The earth did not fight winter. It simply outlasted it. That summer, while his neighboring homesteaders cleared brush, repaired wagon wheels, and chopped piles of firewood, Samuel began quietly digging beneath his barn floor. He made no public announcements. He did not seek advice from local carpenters. He did not ask permission from men who would have scoffed at his plan and called it a foolish waste of summer labor. He simply picked up his iron mining pick, his flat shovel, and his heavy wooden hauling buckets and went to work. Every morning, after the livestock were fed and the morning farm chores were wrapped up, Samuel would disappear through the heavy barn doors. Margaret would bring him a tin cup of fresh water and a cold biscuit at noon, asking quietly how the excavation was progressing, and he would simply offer a firm nod. The children knew their father was working on a secret project beneath the barn floor, but frontier children raised in high-country isolation learned early not to ask unnecessary questions. In a harsh climate where basic survival was measured in cordwood stacks and sealed mason jars, every adult had work to do. What Samuel was constructing was not merely a subterranean hole. It was a masterclass in vernacular thermodynamics that most timber builders never understood because they had never been forced to live underground. Every mountain settler understood that heat rises and cold air sinks. It was common knowledge, but what most settlers failed to grasp was the massive thermal capacity of solid stone and earth. A traditional wooden cabin built above ground was essentially a thin wooden box suspended in an ocean of moving, freezing air. The wood had almost no density, meaning it could not store heat. The moment the hearth fire died, The thin air inside the cabin cooled instantly, pulled outward by the freezing atmospheric wind scrubbing against the exterior logs. A subterranean shelter, however, reversed the physics completely. By sinking the living chamber 6 feet beneath the soil level, Samuel was eliminating the primary killer of frontier heating, wind chill velocity. Wind cannot blow through 6 feet of solid packed mountain earth. Furthermore, instead of trying to heat an indoor environment from 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit up to a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a massive temperature jump of nearly 95 degrees, an underground chamber started at a natural Earth baseline of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Samuel was not trying to generate warmth from scratch. He was merely adding a tiny nudge of heat to a massive, stable planetary foundation. The physical labor was slow, methodical, and entirely invisible from the road. Samuel selected his barn for 3 tactical reasons. First, the existing barn roof provided total cover from summer rain and kept his digging hidden from nosy neighbors. Second, the barn had been constructed on a gentle, elevated knoll of hard clay and gravel, ensuring that natural groundwater would drain away from the foundation rather than pooling inside. Third, in frontier culture, nobody paid attention to what a farmer was doing inside his own barn. He began digging in early June, as soon as the upper crust of soil had thawed completely. The structural blueprint was simple in theory, but demanding in execution. He required an underground chamber measuring 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet deep. The heavy pine floorboards of the barn above would serve as the structural roof of his chamber. Access would be gained through a hidden trapdoor concealed beneath heavy bales of hay and old harness tack. Ventilation would be provided by a custom air shaft concealed within the hollow double wall of the barn, venting subtly outside through an upper knothole. The excavation was backbreaking work that recalled his hardest days in the butte shafts. Pick, shovel, bucket. He carried the excavated earth out of the barn in the dead of night, spreading it evenly across his far oat field, where the dark soil blended seamlessly into the plowed dirt. Every strike of his mining pick drove him deeper into the earth's natural thermal shield. By mid-July, the pit had reached its full 6-foot depth, but a dirt hole in the ground was useless on its own. Moisture would seep through, loose dirt would crumble, and atmospheric dampness would make the air unbreathable. Samuel began lining the excavated earthen walls with dense fieldstone, heavy granite, and limestone boulders he had cleared from his fields over the previous 3 seasons. Each stone was hand-selected, fitted tightly against its neighbor, and dry-stacked with a thick mortar mix made from local clay, fine river sand, and dried horsehair. The stone walls were built to breathe, just enough to permit microscopic moisture evaporation while creating a dense thermal barrier that would hold internal warmth. The northern and western walls of the chamber, which faced the prevailing Arctic winds blowing across the valley above, were built 18 inches thick, compared to 12 inches on the sheltered side. The chamber floor presented the most critical thermodynamic challenge. If he left bare earth beneath their boots, ground moisture would constantly rise, creating damp cold that would rot bedding and chill human limbs. To solve this, Samuel excavated an extra 8 inches below his intended floor level and laid down a dense bed of smooth river gravel to facilitate subfloor drainage. Over the gravel, he poured a deep layer of dry river sand and topped it with flat, hand-chiseled slabs of gray limestone fitted tight as a tabletop. This heavy limestone floor acted as a thermal mass battery. Just like the rock face, say the Butte copper mines, solid limestone absorbs radiant warmth very slowly when a heat source is present, holds that warmth within its dense mineral matrix, and radiates it gently back into the room for hours after the fire goes out. The ceiling of the subterranean chamber was formed by the barn floor joists above, but Samuel reinforced the timber structure heavily. He installed extra hand-hewn fir joists, dropped the spacing between beams down to 12 inches, and nailed down double-thick pine planking. He could not risk a structural failure if heavy livestock or loaded hay wagons were moved across the barn floor above. To insulate the ceiling against the freezing air of the unheated barn interior, Samuel packed the 6-inch spaces between the ceiling joists with a dense, custom insulation mixture composed of dry clay, crushed wheat straw, and pine sawdust. It created a dense, fire-resistant, airtight thermal blanket overhead. Ventilation was the final engineering hurdle. In a sealed underground chamber, human respiration produces moisture and carbon dioxide, while any small heat source produces carbon monoxide. Without proper airflow, a subterranean space becomes damp, moldy, and deadly. Samuel constructed a vertical intake and exhaust shaft using 4-inch square pine ducting that ran from the floor of the underground chamber, up through the interior wall of the barn, and out through a subtle exterior opening under the roof eaves. At the bottom of the duct inside the chamber, he installed a hand-forged iron slide damper. By opening or closing the damper a mere half-inch, he could precisely control the intake of fresh outside air, using natural thermal convection to draw oxygen into the room without creating a freezing draft. For a heating element, Samuel knew he did not need a massive, wood-devouring iron parlor stove. The chamber only required a tiny thermal kick. He built a small stone hearth pit in the center of the limestone floor, 2 feet across, lined with high-density firebrick he had traded for in Helena. Here lay his cleverest design feature, the horizontal thermal flue. Instead of running the smoke pipes straight up through the barn roof, which would allow 80% of the fire's heat to escape directly into the sky, Samuel ran a heavy cast-iron flue pipe horizontally across the floor of the chamber, burying it beneath 8 inches of packed river gravel and stone along the edge of the wall before letting it rise out the back of the barn. As hot smoke and exhaust gases traveled horizontally through the buried iron pipe, the heat was absorbed entirely by the gravel and stone floor before the gas ever reached the outside air. Every square inch of the subterranean chamber was engineered to capture, hold, and reuse thermal energy. The system operated on a singular physics principle: establish the planet's 55-degree Fahrenheit Earth temperature as your starting baseline, introduce a minimal amount of heat, and allow dense stone thermal mass to retain that heat indefinitely. Samuel was not trying to win an aggressive war against 30 below zero Fahrenheit winter weather. He was simply lifting his family's living environment from 55 degrees up to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. A gentle 10-degree lift, compared to the brutal 60 or 70-degree constant struggle, his log cabin endured every single night. In late August, Samuel conducted his first system tests. He built a small fire in the brick hearth pit using damp green pine twigs to generate maximum smoke. He stood inside the closed chamber, watching the smoke draw cleanly into the horizontal flue without a single whisker of backdraft entering the room. He adjusted the iron ventilation damper until the air felt crisp, fresh, and completely free of smoke. During a torrential late summer rainstorm that dropped 2 inches of water on the valley in 3 hours, Samuel sat quietly in his underground room with a kerosene lantern, watching the stone walls. Not a single drop of water leaked through the fieldstone masonry. The river gravel drainage bed beneath the limestone floor carried all groundwater away to a lower drainage ditch outside the barn knoll. By late September, as the first yellow aspen leaves began to fall from the mountain slopes, Samuel quietly moved essential furniture down through the trapdoor. A sturdy oak table, 4 ladder-back chairs, built-in wooden bunks packed with fresh dry straw mattresses, kerosene lamp sconces, and wooden shelves stocked with Margaret's home-canned tomatoes, salted pork, and dried berries. By mid-October, the subterranean sanctuary was fully operational. From above ground, the entire setup remained completely invisible. The heavy wooden trapdoor in the barn floor was buried beneath 3 feet of loose clover hay, rusty horse tack, and discarded farm tools. The exterior ventilation pipe was hidden behind an old pine siding board on the back wall of the barn. The tiny exhaust chimney projected just 10 inches above the earth at the rear of the structure, releasing a faint whisker of heat that looked like nothing more than steam rising from a horse manure pile. Samuel Garrett had successfully engineered a frontier living shelter that existed entirely outside the laws of high country weather. A space hidden in plain sight, protected beneath the frost line, shielded from the wind, and bathed in the steady warmth of the earth itself. Word spread faster than the cold wind. In a small, isolated frontier settlement like the valley outside Helena, Privacy was a luxury that few homesteaders could maintain for long. It started quietly at first, a casual remark exchanged over a sack of cornmeal at the local dry goods store, then grew louder as the autumn days shortened. "Garrett has gone and dug himself a massive cellar directly under his barn floor," one farmer whispered. Caleb Drummond, Samuel's nearest neighboring farmer, had been passing by in late October to return a heavy wood-cleaving maul when he caught a glimpse of Samuel lifting the concealed wooden trapdoor in the center of the barn aisle. When Samuel casually explained his plan, that he intended to move his wife and 3 young children underground if the severe mountain cold threatened their safety, Drummond had stared at him in utter disbelief. "You dug a pit directly beneath your barn floor joists?" Caleb had blurted out, shaking his head in alarm. "Sam, you are going to bring the entire heavy structure down on your family's heads. That floor supports thousands of pounds of hay bales and livestock. You dig out 6 feet of supporting soil underneath it, and the earth will give way the moment a heavy snow loads the barn roof. You are asking for a catastrophic cave-in." Samuel attempted to explain the heavy fir timber joist reinforcement he had installed, the precise 12-inch beam spacing, and the structural load distribution he had calculated based on deep mining timbering standards. But Caleb was not a miner. He was a timber farmer who believed that safety lived above ground, anchored by heavy pine logs resting firmly on solid earth. Within a week, the story had circulated across the entire valley floor. The settlers did not view Samuel's project with hostility, but rather with the casual, pitying dismissiveness that hard-working frontier people reserve for ideas that sound entirely too bizarre to be practical. Living underground? One local rancher joked at the blacksmith shop, like some kind of oversized groundhog, when Robert Finch, the closest thing the territorial settlement had to a master carpenter and experienced timber builder, stopped by the Garrett homestead in late October to borrow a crosscut saw, he demanded to see the trapdoor for himself. Finch was a formidable, weather-beaten man who had spent 30 years building structures across the Western Territories. He had constructed timber cabins in Wyoming, log barns in Idaho, and even the timber framing for the new church in town. He walked onto the barn floor, peered down into the dark stone-lined opening, and scoffed. "So that is your grand winter survival strategy?" Finch asked, folding his calloused arms across his chest. "A deep hole in the dirt?" Samuel stood patiently beside the carpenter and outlined the foundational physics of his design. He explained the stable 55-degree Fahrenheit earth baseline temperature beneath the frost line. He described the thermal heat retention of dense fieldstone masonry. He showed him the custom horizontal floor flue and the subtle 4-inch iron-damped intake ventilation duct. Robert Finch listened with the weary patience of a professional builder who had heard foolish amateur theories many times before. "Sam," Finch said, his voice dropping into a stern, authoritative tone, "I have personally framed 17 permanent structures in this territory. I have built timber cabins, livestock barns, grain silos, and church steeples. And I will tell you what 3 decades in the West have taught me. Human beings live above the soil, because that is where clean air moves, that is where daylight reaches, and that is where dry wood stays dry. You put your family inside a subterranean pit, and you are inviting 3 fatal problems. First," Finch continued, tapping his thick finger against his palm, "moisture will seep through those stone walls no matter how tight you dry stack them. Ground moisture always wins. By mid-January, your blankets will be soaked with clammy mildew, and your children will be breathing stagnant, rotten vapor. Second, packed soil shifts when the surface freezes solid and expands. That earth pressure will buckle your fieldstone walls inward like eggshells. Third, smoke from your fire pit will trap carbon gas in that enclosed space, because hot air cannot rise properly out of a deep hole. You are asking for trouble that you will not see coming until it has trapped you underground." Robert Finch was not being cruel. He was expressing the absolute consensus of traditional 19th century timber engineering. Above-ground log cabins had been the standard survival shelter for American frontiersmen for over 200 years. To suggest that a buried stone chamber was superior to a thick yellow pine log cabin seemed to defy common sense. Others in the valley were far less polite than Finch. Henry Walsh, who operated the general dry goods supply store in town, made a biting, sarcastic joke that was repeated at every hearth in the district. Garrett is building his wife and children a burial grave before the winter even gets the chance to do it for him, Walsh declared to a crowd of men gathered around his potbelly stove. The gossip inevitably reached Margaret Garrett. She was a proud, practical woman who carried her share of the grueling homestead labor without complaint. She never openly doubted her husband in front of the children, but Samuel could read the anxiety written in the tight lines around her eyes whenever she looked toward the barn. She hesitated when he suggested moving bedding down into the subterranean chamber as the autumn winds began to howl off the peaks. "It is completely safe, Margaret," Samuel assured her softly one evening as they sat by the cabin hearth. "I timbered every ceiling joist using hard mountain fir. The masonry walls are reinforced with 18 inches of solid granite on the windward sides. The ventilation damper works perfectly. The air down there will stay drier than the air in this cabin." "And what happens if the air turns bad while we are asleep?" she asked quietly, her eyes shifting toward 4-year-old James sleeping in the corner. "What happens if the snowdrifts seal your air duct outside?" Samuel did not offer a defensive argument. He understood that raw numbers and physics diagrams on paper meant nothing to a mother terrified for her children's lives. So he did what any practical engineer would do. He decided to prove the thermodynamics through direct physical demonstration. During the first true severe Arctic cold snap of the season, in early November, when the atmospheric temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit above zero and a sharp northern gale rattled the cabin windows, Samuel spent the entire night sleeping down in the underground chamber alone. He took 3 instruments with him: a glass alcohol thermometer, a leather-bound notebook, and a single woolen blanket. He did not light a single scrap of wood in the central fire pit. He wanted to measure the raw, unassisted baseline insulation performance of the earth itself. In the log cabin above, Margaret kept a roaring hearth fire burning all night, consuming nearly 2 full wheelbarrows of split pine logs. Yet despite the roaring fire, the drafty log cabin temperature had plunged to 48 degrees Fahrenheit by 5 o'clock in the morning. Thick frost had coated the inside iron latches of the front door. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Samuel climbed up through the barn trap door and handed Margaret his notebook. She looked at the recorded hourly temperature entries. Down in the unheated subterranean chamber, surrounded by granite fieldstone and 6 feet of solid earth, the thermometer had never budged. Without a single ember of fire burning, the room had stayed at a solid, comfortable 53 degrees Fahrenheit all night long, 5 degrees warmer than the cabin, with 0 wood consumed, 0 drafts, and 0 ice. Margaret looked at the clean glass thermometer, looked at her husband's calm face, and slowly nodded. She did not say a word, but the lingering doubt in her eyes vanished. The rest of the settlement, however, remained completely ignorant of those recorded numbers. They saw only a stubborn farmer who had squandered his precious summer months digging a hole in the dirt when he should have been out in the timber stands felling trees and cutting fuel. They saw a man who foolishly thought his hard rock mining background made him wiser than generations of pioneer settlers who had survived high country winters using axe, saw, and cordwood. Throughout the remainder of November, the neighborhood skepticism hardened into quiet pity. At the supply store, men would shake their heads as Samuel loaded a modest sack of flour onto his wagon. "Garrett is going to freeze his young family to death trying to prove some copper mining trick works on a high country farm," they whispered. At the small wooden church, where the Valley homesteaders gathered, every Sunday morning, local women glanced at Margaret with a mixture of sympathy and muted judgment. After one Sunday service, Mrs. Henley, an elderly matriarch who had survived 40 mountain winters in Montana Territory and lost 2 children to winter fevers, took Margaret firmly by the elbow behind the wagon shed. "Your Samuel is a hard-working, honest man, my dear," Mrs. Henley said, her voice dripping with solemn concern. "But sometimes good men get strange, dangerous ideas fixed in their heads. Do not let foolish pride keep those innocent children down in a cold, damp hole when the severe weather hits. If your cabin fire goes out, you bring those children straight to my house. Do you hear me?" Margaret listened politely, but she did not offer an explanation. What could she possibly say that would convince them? Should she tell Mrs. Henley that she had personally stood inside that subterranean room and felt the steady, gentle warmth radiating from the limestone floorboards? Should she explain that the underground room remained warmer, with no fire at all, than their thick log cabin did with a blazing pine fire raging in the hearth? Should she argue that her husband's 10 years underground had taught him more about the physical laws of thermal mass and earth insulation than 40 years of chopping timber ever could? It would have sounded defensive, like a devoted wife desperately making excuses for her husband's eccentric mistake. So, Margaret simply smiled, thanked the elderly woman for her concern, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside Samuel. "Let the valley talk," Samuel told her quietly as they drove back to their homestead. "Nature does not care about local opinions or tradition. Nature only responds to physics, and physics does not take sides." Here's the thing about frontier engineering. Traditional building practices often persist not because they are scientifically efficient, but simply because they are familiar. A standard 19th century log cabin was essentially a massive atmospheric heat trap operating in reverse. To understand why Samuel's underground chamber was so radically superior, one must examine the hidden thermodynamic flaws of conventional timber construction. When a farmer builds a log cabin above ground, he creates a structure exposed to convective heat loss on 5 complete sides, 4 exterior walls, and the exposed roof. Air is a very poor insulator when it is moving. As the howling mountain wind sweeps across the exterior logs, it creates a powerful low-pressure vacuum on the downwind side of the cabin. This vacuum actively pulls warm interior air out through microscopic cracks in the clay chinking, while simultaneously sucking freezing outside air in through floorboards and window seams. This process creates a destructive phenomenon known as convective draft looping. The warm air generated by a roaring hearth fire rises rapidly toward the ceiling, where it immediately contacts the cold roof boards. As the air cools against the icy roof, it becomes dense, heavy, and sinks rapidly down the far interior walls, creating a constant freezing internal draft at floor level. A family sitting inside a traditional cabin might experience air temperatures of 80 degrees Fahrenheit near their heads, while their boots are resting in a layer of 35-degree Fahrenheit freezing air at floor level. Furthermore, traditional pine logs possess very low thermal mass. While wood is a decent barrier to immediate conduction, it cannot store thermal energy. The moment the heat source stops emitting radiant energy, pine wood loses its heat to the outside atmosphere almost instantaneously. To maintain warmth, the hearth fire must be fed continuously, consuming massive volumes of timber day and night. Samuel Garrett's subterranean chamber completely dismantled every single one of these thermodynamic flaws through vernacular physics. First, by sinking the shelter 6 feet below the surface, Samuel eliminated convective heat loss entirely on all 4 walls. The earth surrounding his fieldstone masonry was not moving. It was static soil. There was no wind vacuum to pull warm air out through the stone seams, and no freezing draft to force its way inward. Second, he harnessed the profound physical concept of thermal mass battery storage. The granite boulders, limestone floor slabs, and clay mortar lining the chamber possessed immense physical density. When heat was introduced into the chamber, these heavy mineral materials absorbed the radiant energy slowly, storing it deep within their atomic structure. Once saturated with thermal energy, solid stone releases that stored heat back into the surrounding air at an exceptionally slow, steady rate. Even if the hearth fire went completely out for 12 hours, the dense stone walls and limestone floor continued to radiate baseline warmth into the room. Third, Samuel utilized the Earth's natural geothermal gradient. While atmospheric air temperatures above ground fluctuate wildly, dropping from 70 degrees Fahrenheit in summer to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in winter, a 50-degree shift in surface air temperature only penetrates a few inches into solid soil. At a depth of 6 feet below the surface, the soil temperature reflects the annual average temperature of the local region, creating a steady, permanent thermal buffer zone that hovers around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in that region of Montana Territory. Instead of fighting an atmospheric battle against minus 40-degree Fahrenheit weather, Samuel's tiny fire pit only needed to heat a room that was already sitting at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. He was not climbing a steep thermodynamic mountain. He was stepping over a minor curb. Finally, his buried horizontal flue pipe was an absolute stroke of vernacular engineering genius. In a standard cabin fireplace, over 80% of the energy released by burning wood travels straight up the vertical stone chimney and escapes into the atmosphere. The radiant heat lost to the sky is astronomical. By bending his cast-iron smoke pipe horizontally and burying it beneath 8 inches of packed river gravel along the subterranean floor, Samuel forced the escaping superheated exhaust gases to travel through 8 feet of thermal stone before reaching the exterior exhaust. The river gravel and limestone floor absorbed nearly 90% of the waste heat from the smoke, converting what would have been lost exhaust energy into floor-level radiant warmth. While his neighboring homesteaders were exhausting their physical strength, cutting, splitting, hauling, and burning cords of green and seasoned timber just to keep their drafty log cabins barely habitable, Samuel Garrett had designed a passive system that allowed the planet itself to do 3/4 of the heavy lifting. As November faded into December, the high mountain sky turned a dark, bruised slate gray. The atmospheric pressure began to plummet rapidly across the territorial territory, signaling the approach of a deep, brutal winter cycle. The local settlers tightened their livestock barn doors, stacked extra firewood against their cabin walls, and prepared to endure the coming freeze, using the same brute force methods their ancestors had always relied upon. They still laughed at Samuel Garrett's subterranean dig. They still made jokes at the general store about the man who lived beneath his barn like a burrowing animal. They were utterly convinced that the coming cold would expose his foolishness, crumble his dirt walls, and force him to come begging for shelter at their fire-warmed log cabins. They had no idea that within weeks, the coldest winter weather in living memory would strike the valley, and the man they called crazy would prove to be the only builder who truly understood how to survive it. December of 1887 came in bitter cold and stayed cold. By the second week of the month, the mercury glass thermometer hanging outside Samuel's cabin window read 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at dawn. By the third week, the atmospheric pressure plunged even lower, driving temperatures down to 25, 30, and eventually 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit across the territorial valley. The snow depth itself was not the primary threat. Mountain settlers were accustomed to shoveling snow. The true killer was the unrelenting, predatory Arctic wind. It slammed down from the high mountain timberlines like an angry, living monster, sweeping across the open valley floor at 40 miles per hour, driving freezing cold through every microscopic seam in every log building in the district. Structures that had stood solid for years began to fail under the sheer kinetic violence of the weather. Chimneys that had drawn smoke efficiently during mild autumn afternoons suddenly suffered from severe atmospheric backdrafts, filling log cabins with thick, choking gray pine smoke. Firewood that families had spent all summer chopping and stacking pulled atmospheric moisture from the freezing air and burned poorly, creating sticky, flammable creosote deposits inside stovepipes. Men were forced to climb onto icy cabin roofs in 30 below 0 Fahrenheit winds just to scrape choked chimneys clean before their homes caught fire. Across the valley floor, the homestead settlement began to suffer in earnest. Caleb Drummond, Samuel's nearest neighbor, was burning through his winter wood supply at more than twice his normal seasonal rate. By mid-December, his wood pile had shrunk so alarmingly that his wife had been forced to abandon the bedrooms entirely. She moved their 3 young children into the small kitchen, hanging heavy wool blankets over the doorways to trap whatever heat they could generate. Even with their cast-iron cook stove burning day and night, consuming precious split pine logs like a roaring furnace, the kitchen temperature hovered precariously in the low 40s. The Drummond children wore heavy wool coats, thick mittens, and leather boots indoors all day long. Every morning, thick sheets of solid ice formed in the porcelain wash basin sitting just 6 feet from the stove. 3 miles south, the Patterson family ran out of dry, seasoned firewood entirely before Christmas Day arrived. In desperation, Patterson was forced to drag green, unseasoned timber down from the hills. Burning green pine produced thick, suffocating smoke and almost no radiant heat. By Christmas Eve, their youngest daughter developed a deep, rattling lung cough that sounded terrifyingly identical to the illness that had nearly claimed young James Garrett the previous winter. Even Robert Finch, the master carpenter, who had warned Samuel about the dangers of underground living, suffered a terrifying structural failure on December 18th. A heavy buildup of volatile pine creosote caught fire inside his fieldstone chimney, cracking the lime mortar firebox and filling his home with suffocating smoke. Finch and his wife were forced to flee their house in 30 below zero Fahrenheit weather, seeking temporary shelter at a neighbor's place while he attempted to rebuild the stone masonry in freezing weather so severe the wet mortar froze solid before it could set. The entire valley was locked in a brutal, exhausting war of attrition against winter, and winter was winning on every front. If you are gaining valuable insights from these historic survival engineering breakdowns, take a quick moment right now to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Your support allows us to keep bringing these forgotten frontier innovations back to life. While the surrounding valley suffered under the Arctic assault, an entirely different reality was unfolding at the Garrett homestead. Samuel had officially moved his wife and 3 children down into the subterranean chamber during the first week of December. He did not do so out of panic. His log cabin above ground was still standing. He moved them down because he wanted to test his physical engineering systems under extreme environmental stress. And above all, he wanted his young children to be warm and safe. Their daily living routine inside the subterranean room was astonishingly simple. Every morning, Samuel would climb down the timber ladder through the barn floor trapdoor. He would light a small fire in the central stone fire pit using just 2 or 3 small sticks of split pine, not a roaring massive blaze, just a modest bed of embers, sufficient to nudge the ambient room temperature up from its static earth baseline of 54 degrees Fahrenheit to a cozy 62 or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. He would feed a single piece of wood to the fire occasionally throughout the afternoon and let the embers die out completely before the family went to sleep at night. The subterranean room retained thermal energy like nothing Samuel had ever experienced above ground. The thick fieldstone walls, warmed gradually by the modest fire and stabilized by the massive 55-degree Fahrenheit earth mass behind them, radiated gentle, steady heat into the room long after the flames had vanished. The flat limestone floorboards stayed warm beneath their wool socks. The dense clay straw insulated ceiling prevented every fraction of warmth from rising into the cold barn above. And because the living chamber sat 6 feet beneath the soil line, below the territorial frost line, the earth itself never froze. It remained locked at that eternal stable planetary baseline that required almost no fuel to maintain. By Christmas Day, while neighboring families were burning through thousands of pounds of firewood just to keep their kitchens above freezing, Samuel Garrett was consuming less than 1/3 of the wood he had burned during the mild winter of the previous year. The children slept comfortably in their straw bunk beds, without heavy coats or frozen boots. Margaret was able to wash clothes, bake bread, and mend clothing without her fingers going numb from cold drafts. The air inside the room was crisp, dry, and entirely free of smoke or dampness. The physical contrast between the drafty cabin above and the subterranean sanctuary below went far beyond mere temperature numbers. In a traditional log cabin, even with a roaring hearth fire, there were always extreme thermal zones. There were freezing draft corners where the mountain wind whistled through log seams, icy floor patches where ground chill radiated up through pine boards, and frosted window zones where ice melted during the day and froze thick again at night. The subterranean chamber possessed none of those flaws. Its internal temperature was completely uniform throughout the entire space. 62 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the room meant 62 degrees Fahrenheit in the furthest corner. The granite walls emitted a steady, soothing, radiant warmth that warmed the human body directly. There were 0 drafts because there was 0 exposure to exterior wind velocity. There was 0 ground dampness because the river gravel drainage bed carried all subfloor moisture away. There was 0 smoke backdraft because the buried horizontal flue pipe created a steady, natural thermal draw out through the back chimney. Elizabeth, Samuel's 9-year-old daughter, noticed the magical quality of the room first. "Mama, she said quietly one evening. "I can read my storybook down here without my hands shivering." And she could. The steady room temperature meant that the kerosene oil in their lamp never thickened or clouded from cold. The total absence of interior drafts meant that the small lamp flame burned steady, yellow, and clear, without flickering or producing black soot. She sat comfortably at the wooden table in her light woolen dress, turning the pages of her book, while 3 miles away, settler children her age lay huddled beneath heavy bison robes in dark rooms, too cold for anything except desperate sleep. From the outside world, the Garrett place looked completely unremarkable. A faint whisker of pine smoke rose from the main cabin chimney during midday, as Samuel still lit a small fire there to cook meals and maintain appearances for passing travelers. A tiny, almost invisible plume of heat rose from the rear barn vent, so small it looked like steam rising from a horse's breath. Snow drifted deep against the barn walls, and thick ice coated the cabin windows. To anyone passing along the valley track, the Garrett homestead looked just as cold, battered, and miserable as every other claim in the territory. Then, 3 days after Christmas, on the morning of December 28th, Caleb Drummond came walking up the snowbound track. Caleb had not originally intended to visit his neighbor that morning, but his 7-year-old son Timothy had been expressing deep concern for the Garrett children. Timothy had noticed that he had not seen William or Elizabeth Garrett playing outside in the snow for over a week. There were no fresh boot tracks in the deep drifts, leading from the Garrett cabin door to the well. There was no steady column of heavy pine smoke pouring from the cabin chimney at night. The homestead looked strangely deserted, almost abandoned. Caleb knew Samuel was alive. He had spotted him briefly near the barn a couple of times, hauling water buckets and feeding his livestock. But something felt terribly wrong to the experienced farmer. In a high-country winter, this brutal survival required constant, aggressive human activity. You expected to hear the steady thud of an axe splitting wood, see dense black smoke pouring from chimneys, and witness the desperate, endless hustle of men fighting the cold. The Garrett place was eerily silent. Caleb walked across the snowdrifts, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly through the frozen crust. The Arctic air was so intensely cold that his breath formed thick ice crystals on his woolen scarf and frozen beard within minutes. He reached the Garrett log cabin and knocked heavily on the thick pine door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, his knuckles striking the frosted wood. Still, no sound came from inside the dark house. Then, through the howling mountain wind, he heard a faint human voice calling out from behind the heavy barn. "Caleb, is that you? Come around the back." Caleb rounded the corner of the barn, his shoulders hunched against the biting wind, and found Samuel standing near the rear timber wall. Samuel was adjusting a small metal damper on a tiny cast-iron pipe that emerged just 10 inches above the snow line. What Caleb saw made him stop dead in his tracks. Samuel was not wearing a heavy bison coat, thick fur hat, or heavy woolen face scarf like every other man in the territory. He was wearing a simple wool work coat, an open collar, no scarf, and thin leather gloves. His face was relaxed, his skin was healthy, and he looked entirely unbothered by the 25 below zero Fahrenheit wind. "Sam," Caleb gasped, his breath steaming in the air. "Where is your family? Timothy has been sick with worry thinking something terrible happened to your kids." Samuel straightened up from the snowbank, brushed off his gloves, and offered a warm, relaxed smile, the first genuine, unburdened smile Caleb had seen on a farmer's face since October. "They are fine, Caleb," Samuel said calmly. "In fact, they are better than fine. Come inside the barn, and I will show you." Samuel led his neighbor through the heavy barn doors into the dim interior. The air inside the unheated barn was cold, smelling of dry clover hay, leather harness oil, and livestock. Gaps in the pine wallboards allowed thin shafts of blue winter daylight to filter across the dirt floor. To Caleb, it looked like any ordinary timber barn. Samuel walked directly to the middle aisle, kicked aside a heavy pile of clover hay, and grasped an iron ring set flush into a thick wooden trapdoor. "You actually dug your family down into a cellar?" Caleb asked, stepping back nervously. "That is where Margaret and the children are staying?" "Not a cellar, Caleb," Samuel replied softly. A sanctuary. Samuel lifted the wooden trapdoor, leaning it back against the hay bales. Instantly, a thick column of warm air rose from the subterranean opening. It was not hot or suffocating air, but a clean, soft, radiant warmth that washed over Caleb's frozen face. It was warmer than the kitchen in Caleb's home, warmer than any building he had set foot in since the previous September. Soft yellow light from kerosene lamps flickered up through the floor opening. Caleb heard the gentle sound of a woman humming a song, accompanied by the bright, clear laughter of young children. "Come on down the ladder," Samuel said, gesturing downward. "See for yourself." Caleb Drummond descended the heavy fir ladder, and what he witnessed when his boots touched the limestone floor made him freeze halfway down the rungs in absolute astonishment. The subterranean room measured 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. The thick fieldstone masonry walls were fitted tight and dry, rising to meet reinforced ceiling timbers. The flat limestone floor was smooth, dry, and warm underfoot. A tiny, modest fire flickered quietly inside the central brick pit, emitting no smoke whatsoever. Sitting around a sturdy wooden table, as relaxed and comfortable as if they were enjoying a warm May afternoon, were Margaret Garrett and her 3 young children. 9-year-old Elizabeth was sitting comfortably, reading her storybook. 7-year-old William was sitting nearby, using a wooden comb to card raw sheep's wool. 4-year-old James was sitting directly on the flat limestone floor, happily stacking carved pine blocks into tiny toy cabins. Not a single person in the room was wearing a coat, heavy sweater, or mittens. Margaret was dressed in a simple cotton house dress, with her sleeves rolled neatly up to her elbows as she prepared bread dough. The air inside the room was not merely warm, it was wonderfully, deeply comfortable. A steady, soothing 64 degrees Fahrenheit enveloped the entire subterranean space. Caleb Drummond stood at the base of the timber ladder, his heavy bison coat feeling suddenly suffocating and ridiculously bulky in the warm room. He stared around the space, trying to process the impossibility of what his eyes were seeing. His own 3 children, living just 3 miles away, were currently huddled beneath dirty wool blankets in a dark, drafty kitchen that they could barely keep above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife's hands were raw, red, and swollen from working in the icy cold. He had burned through 2 full cords of hard timber in 3 weeks, exhausting his physical strength and risking his life hauling wood through mountain drifts. And here stood the Garrett family, living beneath their barn in a space smaller than his kitchen, completely oblivious to the 40 below zero Fahrenheit blizzard raging across the sky above them. They were warmer, safer, and healthier than anyone else in the territory. "Merciful heavens, Sam," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling with sheer awe. Samuel stepped down beside him and explained the physics in simple, plain terms. He pointed to the steady Earth baseline temperature, holding at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. He showed him the immense thermal storage mass of the granite walls and limestone floor. He explained how the buried horizontal flue pipe captured waste exhaust heat and converted it into subfloor warmth. He showed him how the iron damper pulled crisp, fresh air down from outside without creating a freezing draft. "How much firewood have you burned since moving down here?" Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Samuel pointed to a small wooden box sitting in the corner that held a dozen short pieces of split pine. "Maybe 1/4 of a cord total over the last 3 weeks," Samuel answered calmly. Caleb did the mental arithmetic in his head, and the math hit him like a physical blow. He had burned 8 times as much wood as Samuel over the exact same time period, and his family was still freezing every single night. "The stone walls never freeze," Samuel continued smoothly. "The floor stays comfortable. We light a tiny fire in the morning to bring the baseline up and let it die out at night. By 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, this room will still be sitting at 58 degrees Fahrenheit without a single ember burning." Margaret looked up from her bread dough and smiled at Caleb. "The children have not had a single cough or cold all month, Caleb," she said softly. "Last winter, we nearly lost little James to the chest fever. This winter, he sleeps through the night without shivering once." Caleb Drummond walked slowly around the subterranean chamber, touching the dry fieldstone masonry with his gloved hand. It felt solid, permanent, and surprisingly warm to the touch. The design was simple, almost primitive by conventional architectural standards. No glass windows, no decorative oak paneling, No massive iron stoves, just fieldstone, fir timber, river gravel, and a brilliant mastery of natural thermodynamics. He climbed back up the timber ladder into the freezing barn aisle, with Samuel following close behind. They stood together on the cold pine floorboards, and Caleb looked at his neighbor with an expression that mixed profound disbelief with deep, quiet humiliation. "Everyone in the valley thought you were crazy, Sam," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I told my own wife that you were going to collapse your barn and kill your family." "I know," Samuel said quietly, offering a gentle nod. "I heard what people were saying." Caleb shook his head, looking down at his frozen boots, then looked Samuel straight in the eye. "Sam," he said desperately, "can I please bring some people over here to see this? My brother-in-law is struggling to keep his place warm. The Harrison family lost their entire woodpile when their shed collapsed under wet snow. They are running out of timber. They need to see how this works." Samuel placed his hand firmly on Caleb's shoulder. "Bring anyone who needs to see it, Caleb," Samuel replied. "The earth has enough warmth for everyone." Within 48 hours, news of what lay beneath Samuel Garrett's barn exploded across the territorial valley, turning the man they had mocked into the most important builder in the territory. By New Year's Day of 1888, the underground chamber beneath Samuel Garrett's barn had officially transformed from a subject of neighborhood ridicule into a site of genuine pilgrimage. Men who had spent the previous 4 months dismissing Samuel as a crazy, eccentric miner now stood quietly at the base of that fir timber ladder. They brought brass, glass tube thermometers in their coat pockets, leather-bound notebooks in hand, and folding wooden measuring rules, desperate to understand the physical reality of what they were witnessing. The data gathered during those early days of January 1888 was cold, objective, and entirely undeniable. It told a thermodynamic story that no conventional builder could argue against. Robert Finch, the master carpenter who had initially warned Samuel about moisture rot and structural cave-ins, returned to the Garrett homestead on January 2nd. Finch was not a man to let personal stubbornness override hard physical evidence. He brought 2 independent thermometers and a surveyor's tape, determined to conduct a rigorous scientific audit of the subterranean shelter. Finch spent an entire day taking temperature readings across multiple homesteads in the district, recording the ambient atmospheric conditions at identical times. He measured the exact dimensions of Samuel's chamber, inspected the thickness of the fieldstone masonry, examined the ventilation damper, and timed precisely how long a small load of pine firewood would burn in the central fire pit. When he sat down at Henry Walsh's dry goods store that evening, a quiet crowd of local farmers gathered around his table as he opened his notebook. "Here are the exact numbers," Finch announced to the room, his voice solemn and quiet. "At 8 o'clock this morning, the outside air temperature across this valley stood at 18 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside Garrett's log cabin above ground, with a full fire burning in the hearth, my thermometer registered 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside my own log cabin, with our stove burning hot, the air registered 44 degrees Fahrenheit." He paused, adjusting his reading spectacles, and looked up at the gathered settlers. Inside Samuel Garrett's subterranean chamber beneath his barn floor, with a tiny bed of embers burning in a fire pit no larger than a dinner plate, the thermometer registered 63 degrees Fahrenheit. A heavy silence fell over the store. Someone in the back of the room muttered that the thermometer must be faulty. Finch held up his brass measuring rule and shook his head. "I tested both of my thermometers against the doctor's instrument in Helena before I came out here," Finch said firmly. "The instruments are perfectly accurate. And here is the rest of the data." At 9 o'clock this morning, I watched Samuel load his fire pit. He added 3 small pieces of split pine, weighing approximately 8 pounds total. That tiny fire burned quietly for 6 full hours before he added another stick. In those 6 hours, the room temperature dropped from 65 degrees Fahrenheit down to 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Finch leaned forward, tapping his calloused hand against his notebook. "A 4-degree temperature drop over 6 full hours, gentlemen. In my above-ground timber cabin, I lose 4 degrees of heat in 40 minutes the moment my hearth fire burns low." Let that sink in for a moment. The physical implications of Finch's data hit the homesteaders with stunning force. A living environment with that level of thermal mass stability meant vastly less physical labor splitting timber, dramatically reduced risk of chimney fires, and complete protection against deadly drafts. It meant mothers could lay their children down to sleep without fearing they would wake up with shivering chills or lung congestion. It meant a winter survival methodology that required less than 1/5 of the fuel resources everyone else in the territory was burning through. Finch then presented his 4-week timber consumption audit, comparing Samuel's household wood consumption against 6 neighboring homesteads from December 1st to December 28th. During those 4 cold weeks, Finch explained, reading directly from his ledger, the average homestead family in this valley burned approximately 1½ cords of dry timber to maintain a cabin temperature hovering near 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Samuel Garrett burned exactly 1/3 of a cord to maintain a subterranean living temperature of 63 degrees Fahrenheit. That represents a fuel reduction of over 80%. The math didn't lie. An 80% reduction in firewood meant that a farmer who had previously been forced to haul 15 cords of mountain timber through freezing snowdrifts could now comfortably survive an entire 6-month high-country winter on just 3 cords of wood. On January 3rd, Henry Walsh, the dry goods store owner who had previously joked about Garrett digging a grave for his family, rode his wagon out to the Garrett homestead. He did not bring a measuring tape or a thermometer. He brought a genuine, humble apology. "Sam," Walsh said quietly as he stood inside the warm subterranean chamber, "I was dead wrong about you. I said terrible things about your project, and I am deeply ashamed of it. I came out here today to ask if you would be willing to teach the families in this valley how to build these shelters. Because if this Arctic freeze holds through February, half the families in this district are going to run out of firewood before March arrives." Samuel accepted the storekeeper's apology, without a hint of smugness or resentment. He understood that his neighbors had not scoffed out of malice. They had scoffed out of fear and unfamiliarity with physical principles they had never been taught. Over the next 2 weeks, in a corner of Henry Walsh's dry goods store that served as the valley's informal meeting hall, Samuel conducted informal engineering workshops for local homesteaders. He drew clean structural diagrams on a large slate chalkboard, explaining the foundational concepts of subterranean thermodynamics. He showed them how to locate the local frost line, how to calculate fieldstone wall thickness, how to mix clay sand mortar that could breathe without collapsing, and how to construct buried horizontal flue pipes that captured waste heat. He addressed their structural anxieties directly. "You do not need to be an experienced hard rock miner to construct a safe subterranean shelter," Samuel told the packed room of farmers. "You only need 6 feet of depth to reach the planet's baseline temperature buffer. You do not need expensive cut stone. Hand-picked river boulders and dry-packed clay will hold if you construct proper subfloor gravel drainage. You do not need complex iron stoves. A simple brick hearth pit attached to an angled horizontal flue pipe will capture heat far better than a chimney rising straight into the sky." "The key," Samuel emphasized, drawing a long horizontal line across his slate board, "is stepping down below the surface of the earth. Stop fighting the freezing atmosphere above ground and start letting the earth's natural baseline warmth work for you." The local farmers listened with rapt attention, taking detailed notes on scraps of brown paper. Skepticism vanished, replaced by the practical, urgent enthusiasm of men learning a technique that could save their families' lives. By late January of 1888, 3 neighboring families had already begun excavating their own custom adaptations of subterranean shelters across the valley. The McAllister family excavated an 8-foot subterranean room directly beneath their cabin kitchen floor, accessing it through a heavy insulated trapdoor set near their cook stove. By utilizing their existing cabin roof as overhead shelter, they completed their excavation in just 12 days. The Donovan brothers, 2 bachelor farmers who shared adjoining homestead claims, collaborated to construct a large communal subterranean room located between their 2 log cabins, connecting the shelter to both houses via short, timber-framed earth tunnels. Most touchingly, the Patterson family, whose 4-year-old daughter was still recovering from a severe pulmonary cough, excavated a compact underground bedroom directly adjacent to their existing root cellar. Within 48 hours of moving their sick daughter down into the steady 62-degree Fahrenheit subterranean air, her rattling cough cleared entirely, and she slept peacefully through the night for the first time all winter. The rapid valley-wide adoption of subterranean engineering demonstrated a profound truth about frontier survival. Samuel Garrett's idea was not a bizarre, one-off anomaly. It was a scalable, adaptable physical principle, rooted in natural thermodynamics that could be customized to fit any homestead budget or structural layout. Where traditional pioneer building methods relied on brute force, chopping down entire pine forests to burn in drafty wooden boxes, subterranean engineering worked in harmony with the planet's existing physical laws. Margaret Garrett watched the incredible social transformation of her community from the comfortable warmth of her underground sanctuary. Women who had pitied her 2 months earlier now visited her regularly to learn how to store food, keep bedding dry, and manage household chores in a subterranean environment. The children of the valley, who had been sick, shivering, and confined to drafty kitchens, were now healthy, warm, and playing together again. When spring finally arrived in May of 1888, melting the heavy mountain snowdrifts and filling the valley streams with rushing water, the settlers emerged from one of the most brutal winters in Montana territorial history. Yet not a single family in the valley had lost a child to winter lung fevers, and not a single homestead had run completely out of fuel. They survived, not because they fought harder against the high country winter, but because one quiet copper miner had the courage to look beneath his boots and teach them how to stop fighting nature. As we look back on the physical achievements of 19th-century frontier builders like Samuel Garrett, their stories offer a timeless lesson in self-reliance, physical observation, and practical engineering. True survival wisdom is rarely about discovering complex new technology. It is about observing the eternal laws of nature that already exist around us, and having the practical courage to apply them when everyone else calls you crazy. Thank you for watching this historical survival breakdown on our channel. If you found this story inspiring, please subscribe, leave a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comment section below. We will see you in the next episode. Educational note: this presentation contains historically inspired reconstructions created for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific narrative dialogue have been dramatized for narrative flow. While the physical techniques, building specs, and thermodynamic principles discussed are based on authentic frontier building practices and established physical knowledge, any modern real-world construction should always be evaluated according to current building codes, structural engineering standards, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content is intended purely for historical education and entertaining narrative purposes, and does not constitute technical or legal advice.